Okay, so now we're going to take a look at while loops. Now we've seen an example of loops, and this was a for in loops. We did in fact an entire hour on for in loops, and because we already kind of have an idea of how loops work, we're just going to do a small section on while loops. So this is just another way to loop through the code, just like a for in loop, and it performs the same task each time, but this way we can kind of create this loop without as many restrictions. Now there are some problems that come with those restrictions, but it's also nice to have that kind of freedom because it allows us to do more things. So like I said, we've seen these for in loops already, so we're going to compare our while loop to the for in loop so we can kind of see the benefits and downsides to using one over the other. Okay, so now let's talk about while loops. So we've seen for in loops previously. In fact, we did a whole hour-long tutorial on exactly how for in loops work. So we do have an idea now of how to loop through code and how these loops kind of work. So just as a quick refresher, let's just create this simple for in loop. Let's just say index in, let's say 1 to 3. In fact, no, let's say 0 to 3. And we're just going to have something like print Mammoth Interactive. And all this is going to do is it's going to start at an index of 0. It's going to run until index equals 3. And we're just going to have this statement print out at that many times. Okay. So not sure exactly why this isn't running. There we go. We're just going to print out. There we go. So we get Mammoth Interactive being printed 4 times. And just as a quick refresher, we have this index variable. We're starting at 0. And we're going to run it. It will increase by 1 each time until it equals 3. Then it will run once more and then exit. So this is saying index starts at 0. It prints out Mammoth Interactive. Then index changes to 1. Prints again, then to 2. Prints again, then to 3. Prints again, and then exits. Okay. So this is running 4 times because index is starting at 0, increasing by 1, and ending at 3. So that's how the for in loop works. And for in loops are great for when we know the start and end values of index, and we know exactly how many times we want this loop to run. And that's what's so great about it, is that we know it's always going to run this many times. So it's always going to run 4 times unless we put a break statement in there. However, what if we need a loop that's going to loop through and execute this code over and over again, but we don't know exactly how many times it should run? That's where while loops come in handy, when we don't know exactly how many times we want this loop to run. Okay, so the way we can set them up, and I'm just going to comment this out for now, is we have while, and then we have this Swift while statement come up. I'm just going to click on that, and so we have some kind of condition to run, and then some kind of code to execute. So basically, this is saying while this condition is still met, execute this code. Okay, so this could be any kind of a condition. This could be a less than, this could be an equals. Typically we have while some variable is less than some value, then we'll execute this code. For example, if we create this variable I, and let's just give it type int, and I'm just going to give it the value of 0 to start off with. So what we can do is we can say while I is less than maybe 3. In fact, let's have it run as many times as a for loop. Then we can have print, let's just have it print Mammoth Interactive. And then we'll have I++ or I plus equals 1. Okay, there we go. So what's going on here? This is strange syntax, and it's actually doing the same thing as this for loop here. So let me go over exactly what's happening within this while loop. So we have our variable I, and we know it's of type int, and we're giving it the value 0 to start off with. So we're just saying as long as I is less than 4, do whatever's in these parentheses here, which, oh, I don't want that actually. Just going to get rid of that. So we're going to say while I is less than 4, we're going to print out this statement, and then we're going to increase I by 1. So that's what's happening within this while loop, and the reason we have to do this is otherwise it was running infinitely. You saw just before I included this, it would run already about 1600 times. So that's what we've got to be careful of, because with these for in loops, we know that it's only going to run 4 times at most every time, so we don't get stuck inside this infinite loop. Whereas with while loops, unless we give some kind of a bounds and we stick within those bounds, we could potentially get an infinite loop that ends up breaking the code. So while loops are less restrictive than for in loops, but it generally seems to be the theme with most computer programming that if something is more restrictive, then it's easier to deal with, and if something is less restrictive, then it can be a little more confusing and is more prone to causing more errors. Okay, so that's unfortunately the price you pay to have the added freedom. So again, we are usually testing some kind of a value, so we're saying run until this condition is met. In this case, the condition is as long as I is less than 4, the loop will keep running. Okay, and it's just going to do the same thing as with our for loop, which was just print Mammoth Interactive, and then increase I by 1. If we didn't increase I by 1 each time, then we would get this infinite loop because I would never be less than 4. However, if we set I equal to 5, then we get nothing being printed out. And that's because I will never be less than 4 if it's already initialized to have this value of 5. If we start I at 3, then we only get Mammoth Interactive printed once. If we start I at 2, then Mammoth Interactive is printed twice. And that's because we're starting at I equals 2, and then, so it's saying, well, as long as I is less than 4, well, it is. We'll print it and increase I, so then I now equals 3. And then I is still less than 4, so we're going to print it, increase I by 1, and then it's saying, okay, I is no longer less than 4, so exit the loop. And if we print out the value of I, we should have 4 showing up here, and there it is. And that's because we've increased I by 1 up until it's less than 4, and then we exit, or up until it's no longer less than 4, and then we exit. Okay, so that's how while loops work. They're a little less restrictive than for in loops, so it's just a way to execute the same code over and over again. And the great thing about them is that we don't have to know the bounds, so we don't have to know exactly how many times it's going to run, whereas with for in loops we kind of do, so we have to have a lower and an upper bound, whereas with while loops we only really have to have an upper bound, so that means we can run up until this condition is met. Okay, so in this next part we'll be looking at an example, a real-life example of a while loop so that we can gain a better understanding, but for now this is what a while loop looks like. We have this condition. So the while loop just executes this code within these two braces here. It executes it up until this condition is met. So typically you'll have some kind of an integer that is just increasing in value maybe by 1 each time. And we're just executing this code until this condition no longer holds, and then it exits the loop. Okay, so this is an intro to while loops, and yeah, like I said, in this next part coming up, we're going to be looking at a good example so that you guys can kind of solidify your understanding of how these work. Okay, so this part of our tutorial kind of gave an intro into while loops. So this was another form of loop. We've already seen for in loops, but this time with while loops we can kind of run this code until a condition is met, at which point we just exit the loop. So we have while, and then some condition, which is basically the upper bounds of our loop, and we're basically just saying while this condition is met, we'll execute this code, and until this condition is no longer met, we're going to keep doing that. So we found that they were less restrictive than for in loops, because we don't necessarily know how many times the loop will execute. With for in loops, we had a very specific start and end point, and we knew it was going to loop this many times exactly, unless a break statement is in there. However, with the while loop, unless we know specifically what the starting value of our, in this case it was an integer, and we were running until that integer was, as long as that integer was less than a certain value, and unless we know the start and the end, unless we know the start value of that integer going in, we don't necessarily know how many times the loop will execute. So we're going to see a real-life example in this part coming up so that we can gain a better understanding of exactly how these while loops work.